Here on The Colour of Country Life, good to have with us again Jodie Gregg-Smith from the General Manager of the Arid Lands Landscape SA Board. Jodie, thanks for joining us again. We were keen to hear a bit more about kangaroo management. What have you been up to?
Thanks, Ricky. Thanks. Great chance to come back and share some of what's going on in the rangelands of South Australia. So our board is working with a number of other boards, as in landscape boards, and also across government with PIRSA and the Department for Environment and Water, and most importantly with the industry, the kangaroo industry, both meat processors and field processors, and again the landholders, the people that are finding themselves inundated with large numbers of kangaroos at particular times. And of course, after all the big rains we've had, we expect that post-drought we're going to see another population explosion pretty soon that's going to create significant competition and grazing pressure impacts where livestock are grazing in the rangelands of the state.
Now, when it comes to grazing pressure, what's the environmental impact of, if I can call it, overabundance of kangaroos themselves?
So there are so many different ways to look at this, and I guess the project that we have developed is to support all of the policy and regulation realms, but is to also look at it from a number of angles all at the same time. So environmental impact is one thing, impact on production outcomes when there's not enough pasture left for sheep and cattle to graze on when they've been eaten out of house and home by huge numbers of kangaroos that move into properties. We look at the degradation and impact on really significant cultural sites, and of course we look at the social impacts when there are kangaroos everywhere. I think anyone who travels on a highway out in this neck of the woods is very aware that you don't travel after dark because you're likely to come to grief with a kangaroo. So there are many different ways that we look at the kangaroo overabundance issue, and this project, the Kangaroo Partnership, which is funded through the Landscape Priorities Fund under the Landscape Act, is to try and tackle a number of different levels, and that's what these little projects that we've just funded are.
Now, I'm mindful for some of the listeners that will be out there, for instance, a younger generation, but also perhaps when we get this one up on podcast, an international audience. I know there'd been a campaign in America about kangaroo products, and they're apparently in football boots, and they were concerned, and even some people make a joking sort of reference, we're the only country that eats that's on our national coat of arms. Just a common Australian practice for quite some time when it comes to how we manage kangaroo numbers and put them on the plate at times.
So there's so much education and awareness raising that's required, and I think, look, everybody understands the significance of a hard decision that results in a need to reduce numbers. Reality is that our settlement here has created the issue we've got because we've put in water points everywhere to create a very, very successful agriculture and livestock industry. The downside is that the numbers of animals that are out there, if we don't humanely manage them in a way that values them as a resource versus a wasted outcome, is that these animals will die a very slow, cruel death if they are left without management and our intervention. And that is far worse than the humane destruction that's required either under a commercial harvesting where they become a product and every part of the animal can be repurposed onto our plate as pet food, the skins, the collagen, all the different things that come out of it that create another little economy in its own right. And of course, the leather is as good as leather can be. The alternative is these animals die and rot in a paddock somewhere, or that we recognise them as a valuable resource. The misconception that we are taking them to a threshold of where they might become extinct is not accurate. And this project is about changing some of the paradigms around that by educating and increasing the awareness of the issue, should we not deal with it appropriately. And also the despair that's created among landholders when they see these animals dying a cruel, slow death in their paddocks after they've destocked their animals. Their livelihood is gone, their environment is degraded because of the overgrazing, and then they're left with a terrible scenario of lots of dying animals that could have and should have been managed humanely one way or the other.
Yeah, I noticed when we visited Witchelina in the far north of the state, we saw a very saline creek there, and you could see the kangaroos had gone there desperate for a drink during drought, and there was just skeletons and carcasses all along the creek because they'd been that desperate. Clearly the numbers had been high and they'd come back.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Witchelina are obviously a nature reserve, and they pay very close attention to these things, and the way nature manages this if we don't do the right and humane thing. And every other landholder out there has a strong conservation bent, and they don't want to see things like habitats overgrazed for other threatened and endangered species, and that's the other environmental impact, not just the production outcome, as they see the overabundance of kangaroos results in removal of really critical habitat for other species that rely on a healthy and vegetated environment. So there are lots of knock-on effects for us not managing the issue well, and our job as a collective, and this is where we've got landholders engaged, we've got industry engaged, we've got the policymakers, and the consumers of the product to understand that there's some win-win outcomes here. It's not an either-or, and this is just about being responsible land managers and responsible environmentalists, notwithstanding where we respect and understand that people default to the thinking that relates to removing kangaroos. The alternative is crueler if we don't do it.
Now, when it comes to the conservation of the species, do you sort of, in the management, as a polite way of describing how they're managed, but do you sort of pick out particular species? Is there a distinct effort to make sure that the ones that you're removing in the overabundant category are those that are less threatened than others?
Absolutely. Now, the Department for Environment and Water can speak more completely to this, but there is a very clear scientific model that acknowledges the species within the macropods, which is the wide term for all kangaroos. There are species where there are quotas on how many of particular species of kangaroo, whether it's the reds or the eastern greys, etc., that can be removed from a particular area, and the animals are actually tagged when they're removed from the environment, so there's a very close monitoring of what's being taken at any given time. The genetics, all of the things that mean that we are here also to conserve and protect the species are built into the management strategies, which is also an important element that you raised.
Now, when it comes to new technologies, what are the latest ways that management is being undertaken successfully?
So, look, it's important that we understand the context of how many animals are in the environment at any given time, and then an annual quota is identified based on an annual aerial survey. And again, this is undertaken by the Department for Environment and Water, and landholders around the state will know that there are a number of harvesting zones that are surveyed every year that determines what the quota is. We also work closely with field processors. They are the kangaroo shooters. They are highly qualified. They must adhere to very stringent rules around humane destruction. They need to be very carefully regulated and supported, and we work hard to support their capacity. And they each have technologies that mean that they can see animals from a distance in the dark and guarantee a very quick dispatch of that animal, so that it doesn't suffer, and of course that there's no concern about the animal welfare for anybody. To be honest, those animals are out there happily grazing and completely oblivious to what is about to happen. And people who are concerned about animal welfare can consider all other livestock and how they're managed, and the contrast in terms of the happiest animal in the world that might just be munching on grass before it suddenly meets its maker is very different to animals that are moved and trucked and ferried and tested and injected and medicated and all the things in the other livestock industry. So this is as humane an industry as is possible, and we're also looking at some future projects that will hopefully help us with other technologies and predictive tools around the vegetation condition to better plan where we know we're going to have an overabundance and mitigate that with other land management strategies.
Well, Jodie, Gregg-Smith, the General Manager at the Arid Lands Landscape Board, been good to have you with us as we can take part in that education effort across our listening areas in regional Australia and indeed on the internet, on podcast. Thanks so much for joining us today on Flow.
Thank you, Ricky. Take care.